Well, welcome to our Bible study once again of the Gospel of Mark. My name is John Robbins. I'm certainly grateful for your presence as we delve right into what we talked about last week, and then we'll move right along. I'm certainly grateful that you've taken the time and made the effort to be a part of this Bible study. I've gotten feedback from a number of people over the last several weeks regarding Bible study and some of the things that we've done, and I appreciate that very much. I've had several people say to me, John, you're not nearly as self-effacing or as humorous as you are when you're in front of a bunch of people. And my response is, that's true. I'm not in front of a bunch of people. It's just me in front of a camera. It's hard to be self-effacing to myself. Not really interested in hearing what I have to say about certain things to myself. So we're going to do the best we can to continue on with our Bible study, and I do hope that it's helpful and you glean some information from this that will benefit your walk with Christ. Last week, you will recall, as we were in the 4th chapter, Jesus calms the storm, and the disciples, once again, as we now know, lack faith. They don't understand how Jesus could do something like that. As we see in the Gospel of Mark, as is the case in the other Gospels as well, those on the outside, those who we would think know nothing or very little about Jesus, seem to know a great deal about Jesus and who he is and what he's capable of doing. And those on the inside that we know should be aware of what Jesus is all about and who he is are the ones oftentimes who seem not to get it. In this case, once again, the disciples are lacking extraordinarily in their inability to know who Jesus is, once again. And then we dealt with a demoniac who comes into the presence of Jesus and bows down before him. Now, this demon-possessed man lives in a tomb among dead bodies, which psychologically and emotionally would be devastating for any of us. He harms himself, people are afraid of him, he is shackled and chained, but he's able to break away and free himself from that. He's a danger to himself and he's a danger to other people. And he runs into the presence of Jesus, and at first we wonder, how is Jesus going to respond to a man like this? And Jesus responds to that man the way he responds to almost everybody. Well, not almost everybody, to everybody, with a sense of compassion and understanding and love. And Jesus heals this man of his demons. He is called Legion, for there are many. That means there are many who are demon-possessed, and there are many demons within this man. Jesus casts the demons out into the swine. They're in a Gentile region. The swines go off the cliff, and this man has been in a position where he is no longer possessed by that which seeks to destroy him. It's a real blessing for this man, and of course he longs then to walk with Jesus, and what Jesus says to him is, return to your family, go home and be with those who love you. You return to them, and so he does. Then we see an interesting story about a man who comes into the presence of Jesus named Jairus, who's a leader in the synagogue, and Jairus comes to Jesus and says, listen, my daughter is gravely ill. Please come and heal her. And as we've talked about, Jesus could heal from a distance. He doesn't have to be in the presence of anybody to bring about healing, but he chooses to follow Jairus. And that's where Mark begins this saga of healing that is going to take place. And we're going to once again read in the 5th chapter about what Jesus does with a woman who has suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years. So let's look at chapter 5, go back to verse 25, read this again, and then we'll move on. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. So here you have a woman with a flow of blood for 12 years. She is unclean, she is not to be touched. Out of desperation, she has emptied her bank account of all of her funds trying to be made well, and she has actually gotten worse. She has reached a point of pure desperation, and so she's willing to even risk her own life to come into the presence of Jesus because she is now entering into a crowd. She is unclean. Law is clear. She is to separate herself from people when she is unclean, but instead she comes into the presence of the crowd of people trying to reach out and touch Jesus. She is on the outside because she is unclean, but she's really on the inside because she knows who Jesus is and what Jesus is capable of doing. And we have just seen that the disciples don't know, but she does. And so we read, She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, as I mentioned last week, it's fascinating to me to realize that Jesus brings about healing for a desperate woman. The flow of blood ceases. She is immediately made well, and Jesus has to turn and say, "Who touched me?" In other words, Jesus' power to heal took place even when Jesus doesn't know that he is actually healing someone. And as a result, she is made well. "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" The disciples say, "Wait a minute, Jesus, what do you mean, who touched you? There are people everywhere. How would we possibly know? Everybody seems to be touching you." But he looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. So here's the woman who now recognizes that she has been found out. And she comes before Jesus in fear and trembling, saying to Jesus, "I am the one, essentially, who came into your presence and touched you." What is Jesus going to do? I'm sure rushed through her mind. Is he going to condemn her? Is he going to chastise her? Is he going to call her out and have her taken away from the crowd and face the consequences of her desire to be in his presence, but tainting the crowd with uncleanness? What in the world is Jesus going to do? I'm sure that ran through her mind. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Now, this is an extraordinary statement from Jesus. Notice how Jesus refers to her. Daughter, your faith has made you well. He calls her daughter. It's an expression of inclusion. It means you're a part of the family. You're one of us. And if this woman has been isolated or separated from her family or from others for 12 years because of her uncleanness and is not to be touched for that significant period of time, for Jesus to say to her, daughter, is an extraordinary statement. I'm sure she would have been overly emotional in the moment to recognize now she is a part of the family. She is welcome. Jesus has restored her and made her whole, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. This woman is now whole. And notice what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't condemn her in any way. On the contrary, what Jesus does is say to her, your faith has made you well. In other words, daughter, you did this. It is because of your faith in me, says Jesus, that you are made well. You taking the initiative to come into my presence, risking so much, has caused you now to be made well. You did this. Your faith made this happen. It's a blessing that Jesus extends to her, not only physically in her healing, but in so many other ways. Now this woman is somebody. She matters to Jesus. And if she matters to Jesus, she ought to matter to everybody else. Now, we all know what it's like to lack the human touch to a much greater degree than we are used to. I haven't been able to shake a hand in I don't know how long, and I am used to shaking hundreds and hundreds of hands every week, particularly at the end of a service of worship when people exit the sanctuary. I'm usually the one in the narthex greeting people and saying, have a blessed week, I hope things go well, how's the family, what are you up to, shaking hands, receiving hugs. And not being able to do that has caused me to realize how desperately I want to be able to do that, how important the touch is from another human being. This woman initiates the touch by touching Jesus. She is made well. And now she is free to be touched. Can you imagine what it must have been like for her to receive the human touch from Jesus, and then to be called daughter, and then to be affirmed that she is the one, by her initiative, she has been made well. Now remember, Jesus is on the way to the home of Jairus right now. The crowds are pressing in on him because Jairus' daughter is very ill. Mark has got us on this journey, and Jesus now continues along that way. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? In verse 36, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, that is to Jairus, do not fear, only believe. Now notice Jesus has now given him a responsibility. He is to believe. Remember, the woman whose flow of blood stopped, she was made well because of her faith, because she believed. Now Jesus says to Jairus, this is going to be an ingredient in the process of bringing about healing for your daughter. You must believe. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Now notice the lack of faith on the part of those people who are around. Jesus, the Son of the living God, has made a declaration. This young girl is not dead. You think she is. She is just sleeping. This is a momentary kind of thing. And people laugh at him. That is, they mocked him, made fun of him, dismissed him. But this is Jesus, and he doesn't let what other people think stand in the way of his mission and his goal. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. So Jesus dismisses everybody but mom and dad and the handful of disciples who are now with him. Now he took her by the hand and he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. Notice the irony. This little girl is 12 years of age. The woman had a flow of blood for 12 years of age. These are two females, two young women, we assume, one who's had a flow of blood and one who is simply 12 years old. And Jesus responds with extraordinary compassion to these two females in a culture dominated by men. But Jesus does what he needs to do. This girl has lived on planet Earth as long as the woman had the flow of blood, 12 years. And Jesus got up and began to walk about. And she got up, the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this point, they were overcome with amazement. Now we know that when Jesus oftentimes heals in the Gospel of Mark, people are amazed or astonished or astounded. It happens over and over again. Now Jesus reaches out and touches her. Now remember, if that girl is indeed dead, Jesus has once again been tainted. Now remember, he's tainted, if you will, by the woman with the flow of blood because she touched him and she was unclean, which makes Jesus unclean. He couldn't care less. He now comes into the presence of one everybody assumes is dead, and Jesus touches her and he says to her, little girl, get up. And she got up and she began to walk about. That's another indication that she is fully alive. She is walking about. She is making her way. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Another indication that she is fully alive. She's walked about and now she's eating. And people who are alive have to eat in order to stay alive. It's another way in which we see Jesus make it abundantly clear to everybody that this young girl is fully alive. Now, these are two extraordinary stories that I think say a lot about Jesus and his desire to bring about healing and wholeness to people. Mom and dad are grieving the potential loss of their daughter, a 12-year-old girl. Jesus makes his way to be with that family, to be in their presence. There's something about Jesus being in their presence that Jesus knew was important for that family. There was something about Jesus showing compassion for this young girl by touching her and then telling her to get up that was important for the family and important for the young girl. So we see two stories where the touch is critically important. Jesus touching someone who really touched him, and she is made well. And Jesus taking the initiative to touch one that others assume is dead, and she is made well. There is extraordinary power in the touch. We know that, we understand that, and right now we long for that. But Jesus used the touch to bring about healing in all sorts of ways, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, even in the case of the demoniac, psychologically. So we continue on now as we get to the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. I hope you're still with me. I appreciate you being a part of this. Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. So Jesus now goes to Nazareth. Nazareth is a little village that is not mentioned in the Old Testament at all. And so it's just a little out-of-the-way village. It just, once again, as we've said before, emphasizes that Jesus came from the most humble of beginnings. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, a little backwater, out-of-the-way village. He lives in a little small, itty-bitty town, but he's returned home. On the Sabbath, well, we know by now in the Gospel of Mark, if it's the Sabbath, that means something's about to happen. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. Of course they were astounded, amazed, astonished. Jesus is such a great teacher that everyone who hears him is overwhelmed by his capacity to bring about understanding. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" Now, here's what I want you to see. You have a group of people who are impressed with Jesus, but they don't know what to make of him. Jesus has been a great teacher. They hear that Jesus has this capacity to heal people in all sorts of ways. But Jesus has returned to his hometown, and oftentimes people aren't impressed with somebody who returns to their hometown. He's just one of us. And they say, "Isn't he the carpenter?" Now, we oftentimes attribute Jesus to being a carpenter and Joseph being a carpenter. Carpenter was kind of a generic term for a laborer. A carpenter could be somebody who worked with metal or wood or stone. And really what the crowd is saying when they say, "Is this not the son of Mary?" Interestingly enough, you were called the son of your father. Why is Jesus not referred to as the son of Joseph? Instead, he is referred to as the son of Mary. It is almost a term of derision, a put down. He's just one of us. Who does he think he is? He thinks he's a hotshot. He thinks he's big stuff. He's just the son of Mary. He's no better than us. That kind of would have been their point. Now notice this. It says, "And they took offense at him." You know what the old phrase, "familiarity breeds contempt," means? That was the case here. Jesus is walking around like he's somebody. He's not somebody. He's one of us. I remember when he was a little boy, he lived down the street from me. I went to junior high with that kid. Who does he think he is, coming around here and acting like a big shot? That's kind of the mindset of the people in his own hometown. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." So what Jesus says is that prophets, they're honored everywhere they go except among their own people, who just look at him and say, "You're not any better than us. You're one of us. You grew up down the street. Don't act like a big shot around us." And that's how these people seem to respond to Jesus, even in his own hometown. Ironically, they don't embrace him. They don't celebrate. One of ours has made it good and made it big, and he's back among us, and he's the Son of the living God. There is none of that. On the contrary, they're put out with him, and they've taken offense. And it says, "And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief." What I want you to see in the Gospel of Mark is this, that in Mark's wording, faith is a key ingredient in Jesus' capacity to bring about healing. Remember, we see the woman with the flow of blood. Jesus said, "Is your faith that has made you well?" Jairus has just been told his daughter is dead, and Jesus said, "She's not dead, she's just sleeping, so choose to believe." Jairus' faith is a key ingredient in his daughter being made well. And now we see Jesus return to his hometown, and he can't do much good for people because of their unbelief. Clearly what we see in Mark's gospel is that faith is a key ingredient in Jesus being able to do what he needs to do to bring about healing. He could only cure a few people. Now the one who is amazed is Jesus himself. Jesus is amazed at the lack of faith on the part of the people that he calls his hometown. Then he went among the villages teaching. He called the 12, of course that's the disciples, and began to send them out 2 by 2, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. He said to them, wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you, and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet, as a testimony against them. So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. So Jesus gathers his 12 disciples around and he says to them, I'm going to send you out and I'm going to give you authority to cast out demons, to do what needs to be done to make people well. And interestingly enough, at this point, the disciples are given that authority and they use it effectively. But Jesus says, I don't want you to take anything with you. I want you to rely on the hospitality of the people that you encounter. Don't take money, don't take excess food or anything else. Take the bare essentials and go into a community and go into those homes. And if they accept you, great. Do what you need to do. If they don't, shake the dust off your feet. Now, to shake the dust off was a sign of protest. But it was also Jesus' way of saying, let it go, forget it, move on. I remember when I was playing football in junior high school, I remember getting hit hard in the head. And nowadays, I would have been pulled out of the game for good, but back in those days, they would give you smelling salt. And they would shake your head and your helmet, and they would say, shake off the dust, get back in there. Just shake it off and get back in there. Shake the dust off, get rid of the cobwebs and go back. It was a way of saying, forget what just happened and move on. That was dumb. There's no telling how that impacted a lot of young people and affected their capacity to learn or their capacity to think clearly, all those blows to the head. But nevertheless, we see that it was a way of saying to people, just move on. It was Jesus' way of saying, show them that you're protesting the fact that they've rejected what you have to say, which means ultimately they reject me, said Jesus. But also move on. Go on to the next one. Don't stay trapped in a situation that is not helpful. They cast out many demons, verse 13, and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. You got to have faith to be able to do that. Now the disciples have faith. We're going to see this up and down motion with the disciples who lack faith in so many ways and at other times seem to be able to express their faith. But let's move on. But let's first remind ourselves that that means the people who reject Jesus, in the very place where they reject Jesus, now that place has been defiled. It has been defiled. They shake off the dust and they move on. And now we see the story of the death of John the Baptist. Now you will recall at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, we discover that John has died. But now we wait till halfway through, or at least a third of the way through the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, before we find out, how did John die? What is this story all about? It's a rather lengthy story, so I'm going to read it, and then we're going to go back and talk about it. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah, and others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. So now there is rumor about Jesus. And Herod, it says in the Bible, is King Herod. Actually, he was not a king. He was Herod Antipas. He was a tetrarch, which is a lower level ruler, who in the year 39 AD would be banished by Emperor Caligula altogether. But at this point, Herod Antipas, hears about Jesus and is fearful that Jesus is really John the Baptist who has come back from the dead, which of course is not the case. But let's read what we know about how John the Baptist would die. For Herod, verse 17, himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. Now, the Jewish historian Josephus also records the arrest and the execution of John the Baptist. So we have it outside of the Bible in a history book, if you will. So what happened is Herod married his brother's wife, but his brother is still alive. You don't marry your brother's wife if your brother is still alive. Jews didn't allow that. And John the Baptist is confronting Herod about taking his brother's wife when his brother is still alive. Strictly forbidden. And Herod has John imprisoned as a result. For John had been telling Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. Herodias is Herod's new wife. His wife, it's his brother's former wife that is now the wife of Herod. So you have Herod who is married to Herodias. And Herodias had a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests, and the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it." And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom." So Herod now has had a party and is celebrating, and all of a sudden Herodias' daughter comes in and starts dancing. Herod gets excited about that, and in the moment he swears before the audience, which makes it binding legally, "I'll give you up to half of my kingdom. What is it that you want?" She went out and she said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" She replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Now I find this fascinating. You have probably a teenage girl who comes into the presence of her mother and says, "Mom, I get whatever I want. Tell me what I ought to ask for." What kind of mom asks for the head of another human being? That is probably not what Herodias, the younger one, wanted. You can see, "Mom, can I ask for a car? Mom, can I ask for a huge bank account? Mom and Dad, what can I ask for? What can I have?" And Mom says, "I want the head of a human being." Immediately, she rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." For whatever reason, this young girl is not upset about that. She just said, "Okay, if that's what you want, I'll get it for you. I'm going to go get your head. I'll be back in a little bit." The king was deeply grieved, but out of regard for his oaths and for the guest, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately, the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When the disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Can you imagine that? I mean, just the head of John the Baptist, this holy and righteous man, is just being passed around from one person to the next. It is a gruesome story about a woman who had such hatred for a man who called her out, for she was committing a sin. Her husband, Herod, was being called out because he was committing a sin. And as a result, they've decided that the best thing to do is to kill John, and his message, they assumed, would die as a result. There are similarities and parallels between Jesus and those who wanted to kill Jesus, to get rid of what he saw as his fundamental responsibility to declare his message to the world. It's a strange, gruesome, and awful story, but now we know in the Gospel of Mark how it is that John the Baptist has died. Now we're going to stop right there, and we'll pick up next week with the feeding of the 5,000. Now let me just give you a little bit of trivia very quickly. There is only one miracle story that is found in all four Gospels. Only one. Found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Of all the miracles that Jesus performs, the only one found in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. So if you ever play Trivial Pursuit, I don't know if that's one of the questions, but you might want to ask somebody this week, Tell me, what do you know about the Bible? What is the only miracle that Jesus performed that you find in all four Gospels? It is the feeding of the 5,000, and we'll look at that next week. I appreciate you once again being a part of this study. I hope it's helpful. I hope it's meaningful for you, and I'm certainly grateful that you would take time to be a part of it. Blessings to you. Have a great rest of the week.